Welcome to Worcester Black History Moments. These moments are brought to you by the Worcester Black History Project in collaboration with Worcester Historical Museum. Worcester Black History Project recognizes and celebrates the experiences of Black people throughout central Massachusetts. The Worcester Black History Project encourages the preservation and sharing of history through scholarly educational outreach and programming, such as the following virtual presentation.
My name is Stacy Tony Hull, and this is a moment in Worcester's Black history. One of the important accomplishments for Black Americans during and after the Revolutionary War was the rise of the Black churches. In the 1770s, Blacks were not allowed to attend or worship in many white churches. Over a period of time, Blacks resented these discriminating practices and policies of white churches, and many believed it was time to establish their own church. In addition to spiritual growth, Black churches were important training grounds for leadership. Blacks who had been restricted and or excluded from various institutions were able to obtain an education and build leadership skills by developing their own churches. These leadership skills were not only useful in developing Black churches, but were also helpful in establishing Black communities. In the late 1780s, before state laws prohibited Black ministers from preaching to white congregations, Black clergy, such as John Chavis, Henry Evans, Ralph Freeman, and Samuel Wright Ringgold, delivered sermons in the North and South to white parishioners. In some parts of the country, many of these Black churches did not last very long because the ministers were imprisoned and the parishioners were whipped for attending. Many Black churches continued to appear all over the North and South despite these practices. By 1822, Black churches had overcome many of their problems in surviving, and they were looking to expand into other states. In 1820, there were 4,000 Methodists in Philadelphia and some 2,000 Black Methodists in Baltimore. It is important to understand that as Black churches grew in the 1820s, fear also grew around many parts of the nation, largely because slave owners believed that Black ministers would have too much influence over the slaves. Now let's talk about the Worcester Black churches. The first Black church structure existed in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1848. As the population in the city of Worcester grew, so did the number of Black churches, as well as the number of denominations in which people worshiped. Over the years, a great many new churches were established, oftentimes by members of an already established church breaking away and beginning a new church. In the next few minutes, you will be provided a rich history of the 6 chartered Black churches that started in the Worcester community. Belmont AME Zion Church. In 1765, the First Methodist Episcopal Society was established in New York City with the building of the John Street Church. There were several Black members in this congregation, and at that time, the two races found no difficulty in religious rights and privileges. Between the years of 1765 and 1796, the percentage of Black members in the congregation increased, and the church grew popular and influential. But prejudice began to deny Black members and Black preachers many church privileges. Growing conditions of slavery, humiliation, and persecution inspired a few Blacks under the leadership of James Varick to organize the first African American Episcopal Church in 1796. In the year 1800, this group built the church separate from the Methodist Episcopal Church and called it Zion. The General Conference of 1848 voted to make Zion a part of the denominational name. Hence, the church was to be known as the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, or AME Zion. Worcester's Belmont AME Zion Church was organized in 1846 and was first known as the United Society. Meetings were held in the home of Mr. Henry Willard on Summer Street in Worcester. In 1846, the United Society joined with the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and purchased a small building on Exchange Street. In 1848, the congregation outgrew this building and moved to 6 Seaver Street. In 1901, the church moved to 62 Belmont Street and remained there until 1963 when the I-290 Expressway changed the Black community forever. The church moved to 21 Belmont Street and remained there until they purchased the church on 55 Illinois Street in Worcester between the years of 2013 and 2014. The Reverend Clyde D. Talley is the current pastor. John Street Baptist Church. In 1884, there were a few families that migrated from the South and settled in Worcester, Massachusetts. Immediately, they began holding prayer meetings from house to house. There were a few who united with Pleasant Street Baptist Church and First Baptist Church. Great progress was being made, and a mission was formed. The meeting was held in AME Zion Church. The mission continued to grow. Reverend John Berg was called to preach, and under his leadership, success continued until it was advised that a new church be formed. On February 1st, 1885, a call was issued for the formation of a church by members of the mission and former members of the Pleasant Street and First Baptist churches. On February 4th, 1885, the members of the Mount Olive Baptist Mission met at their hall at 460 Main Street, and the Mount Olive Baptist Church was formed. The membership of this church was 16. The Reverend Hiram Conway was the first pastor. The church met in various rented halls in Worcester until 1887, when the members were then able to buy the land and house at 43 John Street and remodeled it into a church. The original mortgage was burned only 4 years after the purchase, and the present church was erected in 1891. The Reverend Hiram Conway remained the pastor until 1920. The current pastor, Reverend Dr. Roosevelt Hughes Jr., has been the pastor of the John Street Baptist Church since 1983. Emmanuel Baptist Church. On January 10, 1976, a small group of people from John Street Baptist Church decided to organize a new church in the Worcester area, and the church was named Emmanuel Baptist Church. The members searched for a place in which to hold their weekly services and selected the building at 717 Main Street. Reverend Richard Wright was officially declared the pastor on March 1, 1976. Musically oriented and gifted, the Reverend Wright helped Emmanuel Baptist Church become the concert center for Black worship in the Worcester community. In the 1980s, Emmanuel Baptist Church was the headquarters of the United Baptist Convention of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. In addition to the Sunday morning worship services, the members of the Emmanuel Baptist Church had found several meaningful ways in which to assist the Worcester community. Although it is not one of the original 6 chartered Worcester Black churches, it remains a strong Black church home to many families today. Mount Olive Pentecostal Church. Mount Olive Pentecostal Church of the United Holy Church of America, Incorporated, was organized in 1923 by the late Mother Mary Waller and Sister Lillian Ferguson. It was a very humble beginning, and they worshiped at a little place on Laurel Street. They continued worshiping, and in 1930, Elder Harris from Brockton, Massachusetts, became their pastor. He continued until 1933 when he called Reverend Lucy Joseph to run a revival for him. At this time, the membership was very small. Reverend Joseph ran a very successful revival, and at the convocation of 1933 of the United Holy Church of America, Elder Harris resigned as pastor in favor of the Reverend Lucy Joseph. Reverend Lucy Joseph continued the work and assisted the church when it moved to Prospect Street, where it remained for many years. In 1963, Mount Olive bought their first church building at 169 Chandler Street, and worship continued under Pastor Joseph until her death in 1967. In 1967, Reverend Lowell Edney became pastor, and the church continued to grow in membership so much that they needed a larger place in which to worship. In 1975, they purchased the old Highland Street Lutheran Church at 60 Highland Street, which was dedicated in April of 1976. Reverend Lowell Edney had contributed greatly to the growth of the church, made improvements to the church, and the church still has a prosperous membership. The current pastor of Mount Olive Pentecostal Church is Elder Esau Vance. This is Stacy Tony Hull. Stay tuned for part 2 of Worcester's Black Churches.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time for another Worcester Black History Moment.